So I don't want to spend too much time messing around, so I'll get into the topic for the day, which is walking the divine path. And so I'll start with a question for you. And then I'll try to wander my way through this massive amount of notes that I have. I'm a prolific reader. I read 3 to 4 books a week, and sometimes I read the same book over and over because I know I've missed something in moments where my mind is wandering, and so I go back and try to pick up a gem or two and add it to my consciousness. I've become acquainted with many concepts of the term divine over the course of my career. Divine intervention, divine mercy, divine timing, divine mother, divine father. In the state of Texas, there is even a city called Divine, Texas, and that's an oxymoron if I ever heard one. But the city, Divine, Texas, is known for its Spanish peanuts, and they are definitely divine, so I guess they have a claim to the title. Anyway, so in the New Testament, second book of Peter, you'll find these words. I quote, "Seeing that the divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and to godliness, and through the true knowledge of him by his glory and his own excellence, for by these things he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises, so that by these promises you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust." Close quote. That's a mouthful. But literally and spiritually and metaphorically and metaphysically, it does suggest that there is a divine path for each one of us. And then the question becomes, are we willing to individually or collectively accept that as a reality for ourselves? And the other question would be, if we're not willing to accept that as a reality for ourselves, are we then stuck in our stuff, as I like to say? So it's a question I try to ask myself every day because I've got a lot of stuff. You know, after years of spiritual work, I still find myself focusing on the stuff of my life, the minutiae, all of the perceived hurts or wrongs or whatever that I choose to focus on in any given moment. Years ago, when I first moved to Nashville, one of the first things I did was go to the Bluebird Cafe to listen to a musician, I can't even unlock my tongue, that later became one of my favorites. His name is Mose Allison. I think he passed a few years ago. But Mose sang a song titled, "I've Been Doing Some Thinking." And in that song, he just riffs about what he's been thinking about. And being a thinker, naturally, that resonated with me because I've been doing some thinking. And over the past couple of years, I've recognized that when serious things happen to us individually or collectively, we just kind of get lost. And COVID is the prime example. I was in San Antonio when COVID hit, and we ended up having to shut down the little small church. There was about 100 people, and not only having to shut it down, but also at the same time try to figure out how to be able to be of service to the constituency that we served. And so we started immediately trying to get on YouTube and use the cell phone to do the filming and the recording. And we're working good at that, and so we got it up and it was running well. And I was a little tired and I needed to take a day off, so I took a Sunday off and just sat at home, and then went back into the office on Monday, and then 2 days later found out that 8 of the people that were involved in the 10 people that were allowed to be in the sanctuary at that time had come down with COVID. And it was devastating. It was exhausting. And I still had to keep going. Had to keep trying to figure out how to keep the church going, but also at the same time have to keep working on my own mental stuff. Not taking on guilt for a pandemic causing so much damage and so much pain in someone else's life. And it wore on me. And I had to do some real serious spiritual work. I had to really, really decide, do I believe these teachings work? I believed that when we were putting together this building because I could see that, you know. We could see the progress, we could see when we weren't progressing, but when you're dealing with mental stuff, sometimes it's a little harder to see whether or not you're being able to kind of push yourself forward. So, the divine path. If you've been in Unity long, you've heard it often said that everything happens for a reason. And I know that, and I believed it, and then I didn't want to believe it. Because none of us want to believe that good can come out of something so horrific or so horrible. We don't want to believe that because we don't want to deal with the horrible aspects of it. But life is challenging. And I learned that fairly early on in this journey. Our challenge is to be able to stand up to life when it is challenging. My childhood concept of a God off in heaven somewhere left me years ago. And I came to my current understanding after years and years of study, and also after years and years of dealing with my own personal issues. And I still try to keep myself active in study. All of that to say this, I want to share something that I've come across a couple of years ago, and I'm still working with it. It's a book titled God is a Verb, and it's subtitled Kabbalah, and the Practice of Mystical Judaism. And the rabbi who wrote this book poses an interesting question. He asks, is that curious. And then he goes on to say, although we have great libraries in which virtually all of the world's wisdom teachings are readily available, and although we have access to more information today than the greatest scholars and monarchs of the past 2,000 years, we have not been able to use this kind of knowledge sufficiently to actually raise our levels of awareness much higher than others could a few thousand years ago. I thought that was humbling, to say the least. And he goes on to say, indeed, many would say we have regressed. And when I look around and think about that term, regressed, and when I think about the progress that has been made over the past 60 years of my lifetime, in a lot of areas I see some regression. And the other side of this coin is Rabbi Kupfer wrote these words, or more appropriately, published a book in 1997. So that's 25 years ago. 20 plus years ago, before our entire world was literally paralyzed because of a pandemic. So what does that have to do with today, and what does it have to do with our title? The line in Mysteries of John where Charles Fillmore says, there is a creative force constantly at work in humanity and all creation, but it is not recognized. It is spirit mind or God mind. Spirit mind or God mind. And that spirit mind or God mind is shining consciously in the minds and hearts of those who recognize it. And then he goes on to say that those who ignore this light do not apprehend it, and to them it is non-existent. So that sets up an interesting dilemma. We often say that God is our source, but what do we mean when we say that? Or have you ever used that term in your life, that God is your source? What does it mean? I'm posing the question literally. Say it. Yes. What else does it mean? Compass. What else? Creator. What else? Inspiration. What else? Love. Guide. What else? What else? What else? What else? What else?
Well, it just means that it's all there for everything that you need.
What else? God is my source. What else? Everything's an easy answer, and I like that, but what else? What else? Oh, yeah. So there are times in life when all of the knowledge we have kind of doesn't measure up to the moment that we're in. And I'll expand on that a little bit. Quite a few years ago, I had a motorcycle accident, and some of you may remember that. And I tore up my left ankle. And when I was carried to the hospital in Franklin, they told me that it was a good possibility that I may never walk again, or if I did walk again, I would have to use a cane, or I would probably have a limp. And I listened to the doctor patiently, and I took that into my heart and my mind, and I had one single prayer. I said, God, I will do anything that comes to my mind to be able to walk again naturally and to be able to heal myself. And so I went through all of the processes, physical therapy and all of that, worked tremendously hard. I think it was around 6 months of physical therapy, sometimes 5 days a week. Had to stand in a bucket of ice water for 30 minutes at a time, and then lift my leg out and put it back in. And so after a few weeks, they allowed me to go home from the hospital. And when I went home, the doctor said, if you really want to be whole again, you're going to have to work at it. And the following Sunday, I sat here in this sanctuary and did the message with a cast on. And then I began my work. And my work was to walk from the mailbox up to the house. I don't know how many of you have ever walked up this grade. That grade looks pretty easy, but it's work. And I worked and I worked and I worked. And so today I walk quite well. And just as an aside to that story, when I got here this past week, I said I've got to give the grade a try. I went out, and my first time coming up right out here was about as far as I could get without. But I said, I got to go. So I gathered myself up and walked all the way back to the barn, turned across the parking lot, went down there, and said, got to go back again. Went down to the bottom, came up, second time's a little better. And then I went in the house and sat down for about 20 minutes, so I said, one more. And I went out, and I did one more. So I'm still working on this leg. Keep it flowing, keep it flowing. That's the way it is with every challenge. Business, running a church, leading a family, in school, in college. It requires energy, it requires effort, and it requires faith. Not just faith in an infinite, but faith in the infinite in you. And that was Charles Fillmore's main point, is it's a wonderful thing to have faith in the Father, as he used to refer to him, but it's also a much more wonderful thing to have faith in the Spirit of the Father in you. And so walking this path, the spiritual path, is something that is not new to any of us, really, because that's what life is about. It's about walking a path. We've gotten it, I think, a little bit confused by the religiosity of church, and so we sort of give our power away instead of enabling ourselves to express the fullness of it ourselves. All the things we know have tremendous value for us. And all the things we don't know also have some value for us. And so sometimes we don't have to know that God is in us. We just have to get up and do what we have been being led to do. And my experience over the years tells me that that's easier said than done. So how do we continue to walk this path? And I think one of the first things we have to do is learn how to be creative. If I ask you, are you creative? More than likely, most answers would be, no, I'm not a creative person. But the reality is we all have the spirit of the divine in us, so we are all creative. Sometimes we've got too much sense to know how creative we are. Pablo Picasso said the greatest enemy of creativity is good sense. I've allowed my good sense to talk me out of innumerable opportunities. I really have. And I'd venture a guess that most of us in here have done the same thing. Many times, we've got too much good sense. We've got too much good sense to try something different. We've got too much good sense to take a calculated risk, or too much good sense to step out on faith, or too much good sense to trust in our own creativity. And creativity comes to us automatically when we step out on faith. So I've never thought of spirituality as being complicated. I just believe. And if I can believe enough, then I can do what it is I need to do. I've had a long and incredible career. I walked away from here after 16 years because I needed another challenge, really. And I went to work in Phoenix as an associate minister to be the pastor there for that fairly large community at that point in time, which was about 1,500 people. And it enabled me to learn some skills that I didn't have, and also to hone some skills that I did have. And I did that for 7 years. And then I decided I need another challenge. And I left there and went to Chesapeake, Virginia, to work with a colleague of mine, Laura Bennett, who is an incredible Bible scholar. And I just wanted to work with her and learn from her. So I worked for her for 3 years. And then my last tenure course was in San Antonio, where I just loved the city, loved the people, loved the diversity, loved the energy, just continually challenging myself to get a little better, to do things a little differently. So I don't want to bore you by telling you all the stories about myself. Just want to coin one more phrase with you. This is about compassion. We all have stuff that we struggle with. But the great thing about compassion is you can share it. That's what it's about. It's shareability. So if we're truly compassionate, someone else might care enough to help us when we're in trouble. So during my tenure in San Antonio, I was walking down the street one day and I met a street person shortly before I left. And when I spoke, he spoke, and we passed by, And then he turned around and he said, "Sir?" And I said, "Yes." So I went back to where he was standing. He said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "When I saw you coming toward me, you were limping." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what leg was it on?" And he said, "It was on your left side." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Thank you." And then I turned to walk away because I hadn't limped. But then I went back to him and I said, "How did you see that?" He said, "I don't know. I just saw it." I said, "Well, I'll share an interesting story with you." And then I shared the story about the motorcycle wreck and about my work on the limp. And he shook his head in amazement and said, "Wow, I don't know." And I said, "Wow, I don't either." But the point is that there's much more to life than what we see. Much, much, much more. I don't know how it's possible for him to have seen that. He doesn't know how it's possible. And I don't know how many times he may have had these kinds of experiences in his life. But I know that there is a power in this universe that enables us to be much more than we think we are, to do much more than we think we can do, to see things that we normally couldn't see, to hear things that we normally couldn't hear. But in order for that to happen, we have to be open and receptive enough to allow it to take place. And one of the ways of being open and receptive enough is believing that you're worthy enough to receive those incredible gifts. Believing that you're worthy enough to receive those incredible gifts. So why do I use that term worthy? Because the foundation of our Christianity has been based on unworthiness. The only person or entity that is, quote, worthy is Jesus Christ. But what about the Christ in you? What about the Christ in you? We separate ourselves from our God power because we placed our God off somewhere in the heavens instead of accepting the possibility that the Spirit of God can be in us. No matter what we do, no matter what our habits are, no matter what our belief is, the Spirit is still there. So hold on to it. Final thing I'll talk to you about is compassion. I've learned more about compassion doing this work than I think I ever wanted to learn. To be able to see my brother laying in the ditch and to reach into my pocket and give him a 5 or a 10 or whatever I have in my pocket, no matter what he's going to spend it on, has been the greatest gift I've ever been given. Never done it in which I haven't gotten home and felt better about myself. And to spend $5 or $10 to feel good about yourself is nothing, believe me. So I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time up here. I could talk all afternoon and then we wouldn't get a chance to eat. I want to thank you for inviting me back. I want to thank Michael for making me cry. And also want to thank all the great musicians that really inspired me in this building and in this process of being here in Nashville, because they made a huge and tremendous difference in my life. And it was just incredible when Richard McDeachy decided to go into the ministry, and he's now down in Chesapeake, Virginia, where I was. So that all of this just fills my heart so much, and I'm grateful. And